Let's go.
My name is Aditya, and today I'm going to be talking about fine-grained authorization. But first, a little bit about me. So prior to joining WorkOS, I was the co-founder and CEO of a company called Warrant, which was actually acquired by WorkOS just a few months ago, back in April. Prior to that, so I have like a decade plus years of experience building all kinds of consumer and enterprise software products at companies like Lyft, Medallia, Yahoo. But really, the last 3 years, I've spent a lot of time building and just in general focused on authorization and access control. So that's really what I'm pretty excited to talk about today. But before I get into fine-grained authorization, I want to just kind of start level set by talking about what is just authorization in general, right? So I think the audience in this room is probably at this point, hopefully very familiar with just the concept of auth in general, right? If you think about auth, you can look at it as this combination of authentication plus authorization. If you add those two together, that's like all of auth. Authentication or authn is all about who are you, identity, right? We're talking about the login box, how you log into an application. That's all kind of authn. Authorization or authz is really what can you do once you're inside of an application? Like what permissions do you have? Do you have different permissions than somebody else? All of that kind of can differ user by user. Now, authn is typically like a day zero problem, right? Identity, like how are your users going to log into your applications, like typically one of the first things that you're going to build out, your login box. Authz, on the other hand, can come later. Like when that later is really depends on the type of application you're building. Who are your users? Who are you selling this product to? Can come like a week later, maybe years later, depends. Let's take a practical example of kind of authn in the wild. If you look at your driver's license, this is like a good example of authentication, like it's your identity. It has your picture, your first name, last name, date of birth, other things like your signature, where you live, et cetera, et cetera. This has presumably been authenticated through a trusted party, in this case, the state of California. So if you present this, at like TSA checkpoint, whatever, people can look at you, look at your ID, authenticate who you are, right? Makes sense? Your ID is also a form of authorization. So if you look in this like top right-hand corner, it's like Class C for like a regular driver's license. That gives you the ability to drive, anything from like a Mini Cooper up to like a Cybertruck. But you can't drive like an 18-wheeler. You can't drive, I don't know, an ambulance or even a motorcycle unless you have that particular entitlement. You've taken that test. So in this way, your driver's license is also just subtly a form of authorization. What can you do with this? Let's talk about authorization, though, in the context of B2B apps. Now, most people, again, here, probably familiar with this concept of RBAC, right? Like, raise your hands if you've heard of RBAC before, role-based access control. Okay, wow, nearly everybody. So you've probably seen terms like this, admin, owner, manager, member. Maybe this is how you've implemented it within your application as well. Presumably, admins have extra access and they can do things in the application that other users like managers, members, maybe they can't do. But these days, modern applications are actually getting more granular. This is just a trend that we've been kind of seeing. As an example, I took a screenshot of our GitHub organization. This is the WorkOS GitHub organization. I was just looking at it the other day. We have 26 teams across all of our organization. This is like, you can slice and dice it any way. There's different teams within engineering, different functions, different people in different teams, and this is all for access control because each of these teams has access to a different repository or groups of repositories. They can push and pull, all these different things. So I just thought this is a cool way, like GitHub allows this more granular way of doing permissions around the resources that matter in the scope of GitHub, which is repos. So really, things are kind of going from this coarse-grained RBAC way of defining permissions, things like all admins within my application can edit all reports, to something that's much more granular. The ability to do these like authorization rules and do more specific things, like in this case, Aditya, who's an admin, can edit a specific report titled metrics. And this is really what we call fine-grained authorization, or this concept of FGA. But why are apps kind of going towards being more fine-grained? Like, why did GitHub decide that, we should be able to define our own teams and have repos and, be able to do access at that level? Well, first, I think in general, B2B applications are just getting more and more consumerified, if that's a word. They're starting to behave more and more like consumer apps, and this is just a trend that's been happening for the last 10 plus years. This is another example that I kind of took from just day to day. So we use this application at WorkOS called Gong. Great tool. I don't know if we have anyone from Gong here. But Gong allows you to record videos, with pretty much anyone. So if you're having meetings with customers, prospects, support meetings, et cetera, you can record these. It does these really cool AI transcription summaries. The other day, a customer asked me to share a snippet of our conversation that they could reference later on. I have never done this before. I just went into Gong, I clicked on this little share button. This modal popped up that looks here, kind of like this on the right. And to me, as someone who's used YouTube for the last 15 years, it looked very similar. The way that I shared this video in the context of Gong was just like you would do in YouTube. And so this is an example of enterprise apps becoming more and more consumer-like. And really at the center of this is the fine-grained control or access, in this case, around user-generated videos. Another push towards more granular permissions is coming from this concept of zero trust authorization, or just in general, zero trust security. Maybe some of you have heard this kind of buzzword or buzz term before. It used to be that enterprises kind of followed this walled garden approach, right? Maybe still is true. How many of you have to sign into a VPN in order to access enterprise tools, software, whatever that it might be? So in that old way of doing things, in the walled garden approach, users have access to resources as long as they're within this security perimeter. They're logged into the network or the application. But if you're outside, you don't have access to anything. Zero trust is different. Zero trust argues that users should have the bare minimum access that they need in order to do whatever their task or whatever their role is. And that can also change, over the course of whatever they're working on. And so really, in order to be able to do permissions in the zero trust way, it also makes sense to have more and more granular permissions, like the ability to access very specific parts of the stack or specific parts of your application, whatever that might be. Now, granular permissions can also actually be a competitive advantage if you think about it from a business perspective. I think we can probably all agree SaaS is a pretty competitive field these days, no matter what vertical you're in, whatever software you're building, whatever industry you're building for. If you have a profitable niche, chances are you probably have competitors. And so in that case, especially if you're selling software to other enterprises who care about security, having more granular permissions than your competition can actually be a competitive advantage. This is a screenshot I took from a blog post that Rippling put out, I think about a year and a half ago, kind of visualizing how they see permissions within their HR system. And at the time when this was actually released, I remember it was a pretty cool thing because not a lot of the kind of incumbents when it comes to these HR systems would allow you to define permissions at this granularity. And so this kind of became a new thing that IT admins as well as HR admins were super excited about because they could now do permissions at this granularity, and it kind of became a competitive advantage for a company like Rippling. Oh, what about AI? Everyone's talking about AI these days, including us. AI is also accelerating this shift towards fine-grained authorization. I think if you think about AI in the context of FGA or just authorization in general, the question you have to ask yourself is what data do your LLMs and presumably any RAG or retrieval augmented generation apps that you're building, what data do they have access to? These are incredibly powerful pieces of technology, but you just kind of deploy them in your product or deploy them in your enterprise, you can get into some interesting scenarios, right? So from a security perspective. Here, another example, I tried to kind of mess around with ChatGPT, ask it a question. In this case, I just said, hey, give me a list of all employees' salaries. I mean, ChatGPT does not have access to our salaries, at least as far as I know. But it's still, OpenAI has built it in such a way that it's aware of this type of an attack vector. And it replied and told me, hey, I can't do this. This is sensitive information. But imagine if you built this type of an application using some off-the-shelf LLM or something into your own products, you have to have the ability to control who has, like a user shouldn't be able to basically prompt these LLMs in such a way to get access to data that they shouldn't have access to, right? So talked a bunch about kind of some of the general industry trends towards FGA. How do you actually implement this in practice? How is this different than what we've already been doing today, or maybe what you've already been doing in your enterprise or your products today? Well, companies have already kind of built FGA systems. There are some examples and case studies out there of companies that have basically built these very fine-grained authorization systems. Here's a couple of examples. Airbnb and Carta, they built their systems, I think back in around the same time, 2021, published a couple of articles about how they did that. The most famous, I think, up to this point is actually Google. So Google released this paper called Zanzibar back in 2019 that kind of goes into the technical details about their FGA service, which they call internally Zanzibar. And I want to kind of go into Zanzibar a little bit because since this paper came out in 2019, Zanzibar is kind of becoming the standard when it comes to application level fine-grained authorization. A lot of the technical challenges that they talk about is kind of what pretty much everyone has to deal with if they're building this type of a system from scratch. So let's talk about that model a little bit. In the Google Zanzibar model, authorization rules, sometimes like ACLs or access control lists, are basically represented as these three-part tuples. Think of them as a relationship that exists between two objects or groups of objects. So in this case, like it's saying user one is an editor of a file that's titled resume or ID resume, whatever that might be. Now, if you kind of think of hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of these rules or facts that make up your entire object graph within your system, you essentially end up with what looks like this authorization graph conceptually, this relationship or a bunch of relationships between different nodes in a graph. This type of a system becomes easy to kind of query and ask it questions like, does this user have access to this document, or what documents does this user have access to? This is what Google ended up building with Zanzibar. And if you scale it out, I mean, the paper goes into this in a lot more detail, but it talks about kind of all the technical challenges it took for them to scale to, if you think about it at Google scale, millions of rules, trillions of checks per day to power their consumer products, particularly like Google Drive. So think of every single Google Doc that exists out in the wild, who has editor access, owner access, all that stuff is kind of flowing through this Zanzibar system. And just the fact that you can model these relationships in this graphical way is a natural fit for application authorization when you're talking about things like inheriting permissions or org level permissions, things like that. So what does it take to go from RBAC to FGA? If a lot of apps today implement RBAC or use RBAC, how do you get to this like Google type Zanzibar model? So in RBAC, again, we're talking about probably a handful of roles and permissions. Going back to my earlier example, maybe you have like 4 or 5 different roles, handful of permissions, maybe anywhere from like 50 to 100. Still not enough that you can still kind of write this in code. You can express this as code. Maybe it's a library that you import into whatever applications you have. Essentially, it's still an application level concern. So this is something that can probably still be owned and maintained by your product team. They can implement RBAC, they can kind of own and maintain it themselves. Now, when you're talking about FGA, particularly this relationship model, you're going from a handful of roles and permissions to millions of rules and resources. This is not something you can represent directly in code. So now you're talking about having a purpose-built, distributed service that's stateful, that basically stores all of these rules, and something that's fast enough that you can query it at runtime and get those answers to who has access to what. So all of a sudden you go from application level concern to probably platform level concern, requiring dedicated staff to essentially build, maintain, deploy this system long term. So yeah, going from RBAC to FGA can be a pretty big lift. Not something to be taken lightly. There are some options. So like I said, you can be kind of like Airbnb, Carta, or even Google, build your own Zanzibar-like service, implement it, build it, maintain it yourself. Since the paper launched back in 2019, there have actually been open source implementations that have kind of taken the best parts of Zanzibar out there. So another option is taking one of those, but again, you're still deploying, maintaining this. It is a platform level concern. And then lastly, also, a lot of companies end up doing this. Maybe you keep your existing authorization service or system. Take it as far as it can go. Maybe it doesn't go all the way fine-grained, but it gets you, depends on your product use cases, but it takes you so far. But really, all of the above kind of take up time and resources. What I think is particularly interesting is that the Zanzibar model of doing authorization allows you to do this fine-grained level of access control, but also allows you to kind of decouple your authorization from the rest of your stack. So going back to what I talked about with, RBAC is part of your app, FGA can kind of be something by itself, right? It doesn't have to live directly within your application. And so this is actually a pretty prime candidate for something that can just live beside the rest of your infrastructure. And so if there was a service out there where you didn't have to own and maintain the infra, like maybe that actually makes sense. And this is the area that we've actually been focused on quite a lot, first with Warrant, but over the last 3 years been working on essentially building a fully managed Google Zanzibar-like FGA service, which we're calling WorkOS FGA. Essentially, we've taken all the best parts of what Google built with Zanzibar, built it as a distributed service that we build, maintain ourselves. And what we really want to do is make the developer experience similar to what it has been and is for something like RBAC. So rather than product teams having to build and maintain this complex infrastructure, it's kind of abstracted away in this, really easy to use APIs that you can just call from your application stack. Code, yeah. So how many of you can probably relate to code that looks like this? You have authorization checks, if user is superadmin, blah, blah, blah. All these things kind of add up over time. But with a centralized authorization service like WorkOS FGA, replace all of that with this abstracted logic. So it just kind of removes all of that to its own logic that can be iterated on kind of separately from the rest of your application. I think last most important question, we talked a lot about FGA, kind of the use cases behind it. I think there is this question about when do you need it. I think in general, like better granular access control is just better for more. If all apps could do it, be great. But it comes down to like when do you actually need it? Like all good computer science arguments, I think the answer is that it depends. But having spent so much time in this space for the last few years, I think there's a few points that I want to kind of call out, and maybe this will get you thinking about FGA in your own stack. If you're building any new product features, think of like if you're building anything like Google Docs, if you're introducing this concept of user-generated content where people are going to be sharing, maybe they're going to be editors, things like that, that might be a good time to start looking at something that's going to be more granular to manage all these permissions at scale. Let's say you're a team that's scaling out. You're moving on from your monolithic code base and now starting to separate out into multiple teams, multiple services. At this point, it probably makes sense to centralize your authorization logic in one place and not have to kind of duplicate and maintain it in multiple places. And so it might make sense to look at an FGA or a centralized Auth type of a service. Of course, if you're targeting larger enterprises, like Fortune 500s, Fortune 100s, these are very, very complex companies. They all have their own requirements when it comes to authorization. You probably have to have a very flexible authorization system to meet the needs of these companies. And lastly, I would say just greenfields development. FGA is complex, but in some cases, it does make sense to actually start with this paradigm in mind. I think like AI is a good example of this, but there are other times when it makes sense to just start with FGA from the get-go. I always kind of like to end. I talked about a lot. I think the main things to kind of take away is, in general, B2B application authorization is just becoming more fine-grained, whether it's industry trends, the way applications are being built, customer demands. It's just things are getting more granular. implementing FGA can be a pretty large undertaking, not to be taken lightly, but something you have to kind of think about, plan for on your roadmap. And it's funny to say this, but it's still new. After having worked on it for nearly 3 years, it's still a pretty new paradigm. But I think what's really cool is there are options these days to do it yourself or to use managed services, of course, like WorkOS FGA. But yeah, with that, I'm going to move into questions. Thank you.
I'm curious if you have any cases where we have some cases where like some people have access to a thing and a very select group, and other people have access to it if they reauth or they enter some information to verify that they have permission to do something. Or do you have any solutions for that kind of problem?
Can you explain a little bit about like what you mean by reauth?
Yeah, sort of like if you have not like certain things in say GitHub, you have to re-log in to delete an organization or something. Or sometimes we need to enter, like for legal audits, we need to enter information before the person can proceed. I'm just curious if there's any solutions you have for that.
Yeah, interesting question. So I think you're probably kind of referencing these are like potentially like tier 0 actions, like things that maybe can't be undone, and so you require like a 2FA or something like that.
Yeah, or even just some not super privileged users need to add stuff to an audit log before they can take that action, whereas like power users would not need to do that.
Yeah. So I think like at least in the concept of the like FGA type of a paradigm, the like ability to do really granular controls allow you to essentially model like every attribute for a particular user and then use those attributes to basically drive the authorization decisions. So like maybe it's a flag that enables someone to do something or not do something. So that can be kind of expressed as like a policy that gets evaluated for a given user. So it really kind of depends, but it's this like combination of some policy logic that executes and maybe on top of some relationship that the user has with like a particular attribute or a particular object.
I think one of the challenges with adding more fine-grained access control is more user and admin confusion on why someone may or may not have access to something. And I'm just wondering if you've seen any really great tooling or best practices around creating that user clarity, or even like debugging tooling for engineers when those questions come up of why can't I click this button and the admin can't figure it out, the user can't figure it out.
That's an excellent question. Now it makes me think of why I didn't cover that in the talk. But yeah, auditability is like one of the hardest things when it comes to authorization in general. Is like, why did I get access or not get access to something? Like, tell me how this happened. And this is actually the Google Zanzibar paper didn't really talk about this much, but I know that, so at least we do, and I know some of the other offerings do as well. We have a variety of developer tooling around essentially like basically debugging access control checks, things like that. Like basically what it comes down to is in a RBAC type system, you're doing these graph traversals to figure out who has access to what. And so if you start with like, does this user have access to this? You can actually query the system in a way in which it tells you, I arrived at this answer by taking these paths, or I arrived at this, like you don't have access based on these paths that I checked in the system. So I guess, yeah, long story short is, yeah, that's a very important part of it. I think that is a pretty big consideration to the like maintainability and manageability of these types of solutions moving forward. I think it starts with just good audit logging. Like, so in our system, for example, every interaction with the system is logged. So every API request, what that result was, why it came to that point, or why it came to that result, all that stuff gets tracked. And then we just offer like tooling on top to be able to essentially, for developers to be able to go in and say, okay, given this request ID, like this is the path that it took and this is the result that it came to. This is what the data looked at that point in time. So then they can kind of like use that to figure out why something happened or not.
Does WorkOS have the ability to do temporary escalation?
Temporary escalation. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so I have a group of customer success people, and they're not allowed to do this thing unless they do an extra. By the way, I'm intentionally authorizing my account to be able to do this thing for the next 15 to 20 minutes.
I think the answer is yes. I think you can think about it in different ways. One feature that we do offer, so this is unrelated to FGA specifically, but there is the ability to impersonate certain users. So oftentimes that's how kind of users are able to do this. Like, I want to see the application from this user's perspective. So I think that's a common way to do it. The time-based one is actually pretty interesting. That follows into a way of doing kind of like policy-based access control. And so there is a ability to be able to kind of do things like time-based. We're talking kind of like low level, but I think in general, the good practice is like impersonations generally kind of like, at least that I think about kind of solving that.
I have an answer for this too over here. We've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about this. Sorry to steal your thunder. I think the right way to do this is to have an ability to like introspect the permission graph for a capability that might not exist yet. So say you had a service that wants to do an action, but you don't know if you have those permissions yet. You can essentially ask like, what permissions would I need in order to do that? And that could result in the permission set getting returned to you, and then you could encapsulate that into like a request that could be approved by somebody else.
Yeah.
So this idea of like taking permissions and building workflows around them is sort of like graduate level FGA as a topic, but it's something that Aditya and I have been talking about at some point adding.
Hi there, I'm Nate from Sierra AI, and I work on an infrastructure team. And when I think about authorization, I sort of think about it at two layers. One is as a request is coming in, should the user be allowed to do that? But then I also think about, as the software engineering team is adding features, are the database accesses or the RPC calls they do in implementing that request, are they properly authorized for the user who's making that request? When you think of the service that you're building, are we mostly at like the sort of entry level, or is it also applicable at the sort of individual database access, RPC level? And that also sort of leads to the question of, does it all need to be done remotely? Can some answers be cached locally so it's faster as we proceed through? Take it away.
I think the best practice generally comes down to, in my opinion, it should be based on like the user, the session. So like at runtime, you're executing some piece of code on behalf of a user, right? So everything should kind of flow from that. So that means like this user should only have access to their own data, their org's data, like whatever that is. In a relationship-based model, like you can kind of, that can all kind of be in the model itself. And then the checks can flow from that, if that makes, like basically if you're in the user's RPC layer, for example, the check would make it such that the relationship graph would never be able to access some other user's data or something like that, if you've architected that graph properly. But I think like the way to keep it simple is to just focus on the user, because that's the context of which that code is executing, right? Does that answer the, okay.
I may
First
do
part.
again afterwards, but that's great. Thank you very much.
I'll talk about the caching actually, since you mentioned it. Yeah, in general, I think like performance is a big concern for a centralized authorization service. It's something we've thought a lot about because it's very chatty. You're going to be checking these permissions all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, we can talk in detail about like kind of how we do that. But in general, yes, lots of caching to make sure that you get answers to these queries like really, really fast.
You talked about user-based. What about location-based? Like there are hospitals that you could only access within that location and that specific hospital. So a doctor going home has no access to the medical confidential files of another patient unless they come on site. Do you guys have that capability?
Yeah, so presumably you could figure that out via like IP address, let's say, right? Yeah, so I think that fits in very much into, I was talking to, I think someone asked a question here, the like policy-driven approach. Like you could create a policy that says you have access to this resource if your IP block falls within this range or something like that. And so that's a policy or a piece of like logic that executes right before or as part of that check. So yeah, in our case, we actually do support policies on top of this relationship graph. So you can basically provide, like we don't look up the IP for the user, but if you provide their IP and you have a policy that states that the user can only access it if they're within this IP or this geolocation or something, yes, it will run that function, and the true or false will determine whether the check succeeds or not. I think it's a very common and valid use case. Yeah.
When it comes to admins administering a system like this, you just talked about policies. Is that kind of the main way that they might want to do this at scale? Are there other things that are important for somebody who's responsible for administering a system that's based on fine-grained access control?
So in this case, for admin, are you talking about like an IT admin? Yeah, this is, we've talked about this a little bit. I think we're maybe not at the point yet where, it's kind of hard to manage like fine-grained permissions if you're an admin. Like it's just, because it can very much depend on what your model looks like. But I do see a future in which we do offer these capabilities to, at least like if you have a graph defined or some like what your authorization logic looks like, it should be possible for like the IT admin to manage that for your application for their customer, right? So I guess the answer is not something we have today, but it's definitely, I think, something we're thinking about for sure.
Maybe a quick follow-up then. Is there a world where having both of these, like fine-grained authorization for end users, but also role-based access control for admins, where that sort of combination makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I generally think of like RBAC as like you have that abstraction of a role in between, and a role is nothing more than just like a group of users that like kind of act and behave the same. So from that perspective, yes, I think you can kind of mesh the two and say that the admin gets to define behavior at this group or role level, but then that individually can flow into like specific users and resources. Yeah, conceptually, yes, I think that's how at least I think about it.
Does the managed service also work with like granular permissions for direct SQL level queries? For instance, instead of going through the application, if you want to do fine-grained permissions on raw data, something like maybe like Snowflake level. Do you support that through the WorkOS solution?
Can you give me like a small example, maybe?
Basically the same thing. Instead of going through an admin tool or an application, if you have all the data of an enterprise and they want to do direct access query, but you want to still apply the granular permissions, how is there like a recommendation on how that kind of design looks for with using the WorkOS product?
So are you saying kind of like use the FGA product as like the permissions
layer,
layer on top of like a data warehouse
yeah,
or something like that? I mean, I think it's possible. Would part of so that like one of the APIs that actually we have in the FGA product is actually, we call it a query API. Essentially, it gives you, like you ask it a question like, what documents does this user have access to? It obviously doesn't have the document data, but it can give you a list of all the document IDs, right? And then you can use those IDs to then look up in whatever is the data warehouse or the actual source of truth, and then hydrate it with the actual document metadata or whatever that it might be. So I think that pattern is probably most similar to kind of, I think, what you're talking about, where another way to put it is it's almost a distributed foreign key constraints across all of your different databases. So it holds like, what users have access to what pieces of data or what like specific rows. But then the actual data itself still lives within, your data layer. So I think there's more of a conceptual answer, but I think like that's kind of the way that I would think about it for a system like this.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Let's go.